Hey, welcome everybody to Anxiety Unraveled. I'm your host, Mike Maddox. I'm so glad that you have chosen to join this podcast and spend some time with us. On this show, we talk about anxiety disorder. We talk about it openly, honestly, what it is, what it isn't, how it's treated, how difficult it can be, but how treatable it is. And I am really excited to have as my guest this week, Josh Zoerhof. Josh, welcome to the program. We'll introduce what you do in a second, but just welcome, brother. Thanks for being with us.
Mike, thanks for having me. I'm super excited to join you for this conversation. Really grateful for the work that you do and the work that you're doing in helping people understand the realities of emotional health in their own lives.
Yeah, and I know something that is near and dear to your heart as well. If folks don't know, Josh is a teaching pastor. Is it the Fearless Group of Churches?
Fearless Family of Churches, that is right.
Fearless Family of Churches. And also a counselor, is a Zoerhof Counseling and Consulting. You do therapy with folks, and the founder of the Worry Work Group. So tell us a little bit about those different roles, Josh. Founding the Worry Work Group, and then doing private counseling, working with businesses on mental health, and then being a teaching pastor all at the same time.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride for me. I think I was reflecting on that with my wife a few days ago. We were driving up to Rockford, of all places. She had a doctor's appointment, and we had about an hour in the car, and that's a rare gift when you can spend an hour with the person you love in uninterrupted quiet. And I said, I've been a pastor for 15 years now. I've worked for the same group of churches for 15 years, and the average lifespan of a pastor in the United States is 3 years, and in tenure in terms of its career, and then it jumps up to 7. And so I have outlasted both of those numbers, but I've also filled a number of roles in my time. I worked in children's and student ministries for a number of years. I worked as a teaching pastor, and then I got my degree in therapy about 10 years ago. I got licensed and credentials to practice therapy. I worked as a clinician for an agency in West Michigan, and I worked in pediatric care, and I worked with young marrieds, and then I started working with couples that have gone through marital distress and infidelity. And I turned into kind of this weird generalist of therapeutic approaches. And then somewhere around the pandemic, there were businesses in the West Michigan area that they noticed that their employees were not coping with the stress of COVID-19 well. And I think for many of us listening, many of us aware of COVID, that whether you want to say it was made up in China or made up in the media or it was made up naturally, it was real in this respect, that it was a global disruption that intensified and I think magnified present stressors of everyday life. So if you had anxiety, it was way worse during COVID. If you had depression, it was way worse. If you were on the verge of substance abuse, it spiked in COVID. It intensified everything. And a lot of these businesses that I now work with, they started to realize that their people were just not coping well. And Mike, I know you and I have talked about this before as well, but there seems to be an increase in the way that people are experiencing symptoms of anxiety and depression. That's not necessarily to say that more people now have anxiety than they did 10 years ago. I think we just have less coping mechanisms, and we have more unhealthy coping mechanisms as well. And so there's this just massive influx for businesses that they were starting to realize our people are not okay. And our managers and our supervisors and our site superintendents and our foremen and our bosses, they are not equipped to have these conversations. They're not social workers.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't know, that's an interesting point. Do you think it's that we have less coping mechanisms, or is it the inverse, that there are so many unhealthy coping mechanisms that they're drowning out the healthy coping mechanisms? Because in my journey, and I shared this with you in the past, I have found really no end to healthy coping mechanisms and therapeutic tools to combat anxiety the more I looked and the more I sought. But, in my day-to-day life, the unhealthy mechanisms they're just everywhere, from just doom scrolling to just mindless Netflix binging to Not that any of that's wrong at a certain level, but those are not going to get you through the fire if you're dealing with an acute anxiety disorder. I don't think. So what are your thoughts on that? Is it that there are
I think
less, or is it just they're being drowned out?
that's a great distinction. We've always had the same amount of coping mechanisms, healthy, unhealthy. I had a pastor friend of mine years ago say there's no such thing as new sin. It's just packaged differently. And in that respect, I think, yes, there are plenty of productive, healthy coping mechanisms for stress. What's different now in our 2025 life from where it was even in the 1970s is there's less human social interaction in person. I don't know if you've ever read the book Bowling Alone, but this was strategized a long time ago that there was a whole sociologists were looking at the fact that less men were gathering together in bowling alleys and we were hunkering down in our little homes and enclaves, and there was less human socialization. So with less human socialization, I think the female equivalent would have been knitting circles. With less human socialization, you get less connectivity, you get less communication, you get less ability to communicate your feelings, and then you throw on top of it the dawn of 2010, the dawn of the iPhone, social media, Facebook, Instagram, Snap, all of that. You throw that all into the mix, and what you get is I can go my entire day believing that I am connected to another human being through this digital universe without ever saying a single word.
Yeah.
And then on top of it, you have an increase in pornography. Now, there's data there to say that big porn is dying and more people are producing their own pornographic content. Plus, you have OnlyFans and you have all of these other sexually destructive behaviors that people are pouring into. You have a 300% increase in alcohol sales in Michigan alone since the pandemic. Substance abuse, you have an opiate crisis. People are finding lots of ways to numb out, and they're finding lots of ways to escape. And the problem with escaping, whether it's through doom scrolling, Netflix, binge watching, pornography, whatever, the problem with escaping is it doesn't actually deal with the anxiety or the problem. It just gives you a break. And in some cases, especially with social media and digital media, it actually increases the brain activity that you have, which your brain then translates into stress. So you think
Yeah.
escaping, but what you're really doing is creating more stress for yourself. So I think that's a really important distinction. When I say we have less coping mechanisms, I think what's probably better is to say we are less likely right now to gravitate towards the best coping mechanisms because
Yeah.
we're so flooded with easier and more powerful in the respect that they are strong skills and coping mechanisms. They're just not helpful for us.
That's so interesting. And, I'm curious if that is what led to, through the Worry Work Group, your company, you created an app called the Worry Work app, which I use and have on my phone. Explain what that is. Was that what you just said, the plethora of unhealthy coping mechanisms, how readily available they are, how destructively deceptive they are, because they do temporarily seem to alleviate symptoms of anxiety, but they don't get to the root of them, and they don't lead to long-term healing. In fact, they exacerbate the symptoms over the long term. Was that what inspired you to come up with the app? Is that one of the
Yeah.
tools that you saw as an antidote to that?
Yeah, that was a large part of it. I think over the years now working with, again, companies, businesses, having a different exposure to a new, not for me, a new way to do therapy gave me an awareness that some of these skills, breathing, mindfulness, gratitude, and we'll get to that in the app, I'm sure, but having some of these skills, these are not hard skills to learn. And they are not hard skills to practice. And yet, the vast majority of people who know them don't utilize them on the regular because they're not nearly as accessible as Facebook, as Twitter or X now, as well, LinkedIn even. It can be something
Right.
now that people are starting to doom scroll on. It's easier to escape in a lot of ways because it's right there on your phone. And the interesting thing too, and you know this as well, your worry is always with you. Your anxiety is always with you. Interestingly enough, your phone is always with you. They've done a lot of research right now that people, when they leave their phone at home, it actually creates anxiety for them. And so I think many of us, what is it, 97% of Americans have a smartphone. And so
Yeah.
we are attached to these things. And so I started thinking, is there a way? Because I'm all about redeeming what in the theological world, what evil or sin has tried to destroy. And I believe that the power of the death and resurrection of Jesus actually allows for whatever has been warped by evil to be used for good. And so I actually feel like there's a way to take these devices that we have and turn them around and utilize them for what can be good and healing.
Makes me think of that song, Storm in the Gates of Hell, taking back what the enemy stole. You know the song I'm talking about?
I
There's
do
a
it now.
line in it. I'm sorry?
I do. I just can't remember the name of it.
Yeah, I'll think of it and the artist, but he's got a line in there that says, "We're storming the gates of hell. We're taking back what the enemy stole." And that's what it reminded me of that when you were talking about, how things that were created for good have been warped by evil to be used for destruction. And they don't have to be. They can be taken back for good. They can be taken back for health and for progress and for what God intended them to be used for without the lies. And I think that you're onto an interesting point because you take your phone at the end of the day, you're tired from work, you're exhausted, you want to just numb out, you want to just kind of relax, okay? You want to just shut your brain down. It's so easy to get into that cycle of doom scrolling or if you're addicted to pornography, it's right there on your phone too, or just even a news feed. Because the news feed is going to cause more anxiety for you. It's going to you're going to see the sensationalism because that's how you sell news is by being sensational and by telling bad news stories. And you wanted to create something that was right there on the phone as well that you could click on that was healthy.
Yes.
That helped people learn the practices and the tools that they need to overcome anxiety and worry. And that's what the app does. Describe what's in the app. So if you open the app, what happens? What's in the app for a user?
My team, the development team that I worked with, and my wife and I, because my wife's a big part of this project as well, we wanted to have a simple, easy to use app that gave therapeutic practices to every person who is using it in a way that they could monitor, they could track their progress, they could even share their progress with friends, with spiritual advisors, with pastors or therapists or doctors. And so when you open up the app, there's really three options. There's the option for review my worry work. There's the option for work on my worry, and then there's a quick tooltip for breathing. And so I'll start with the breathing app. That's a part of the component, but breathing, for those listening, if you're familiar with anxiety and you're familiar with journeying with anxiety, you've probably met with a therapist and they've talked to you about breath work. It is bang for buck, probably one of the easiest strategies to employ to help minimize and reduce your symptoms of anxiety. 2 minutes of deep breathing helps to engage what is called the parasympathetic nervous system, which decreases our symptoms and feelings of stress and increases our feelings of relaxation. And so we utilize something called box breathing. There's lots of different breathing tools. Box breathing is not the only tool, but it is a very effective tool because box breathing helps people to visualize their breath work. And it's really simple. If you imagine a box, you start up in one corner and you move from one corner to the next and you breathe in for 5 seconds. You hold in the next corner for 5 seconds. You breathe out for 5 seconds, moving down to the lower corner, and then you practice being still for 5 seconds. Incidentally, box breathing was created by the military. It's utilized by the Marine Corps to help their marksmen increase their likelihood of hitting the target. And what they do is they breathe around the box and they get to that still portion of the box breathing, and that is where you are at your optimal chance of hitting your target because your body is calm and you are centered and focused. And so we have a whole visualization tool for box breathing. You can do that, just that. If you just did that and you just use that tool, research shows that you can decrease your symptoms of anxiety by 10 to 25% just by breathing for 2 minutes.
It's
That's
amazing.
really powerful.
Yeah, it's incredibly powerful. And I think it goes back to something you mentioned earlier, because that box breathing or other forms of breathing exercises to minimize anxiety, or muscle relaxation techniques are another method, another physical method, something that you can actively physically do to calm your body. There's an action you can take to combat what you think is completely out of your control. It's not. There are things you can physically do to reduce your anxiety and increase the serotonin levels, increase the mechanism in your brain. You know better than I what happens in the brain, but to get the chemicals flowing the way they're supposed to be flowing in order to reduce the anxiety level, that's like a game changer for people.
Man, for me, when I learned that I could actually feel better when I was anxious without having to think about what I was thinking about. I could just do something physical, because the thing is, the thoughts can be really overwhelming.
Oh yeah.
And, traditional cognitive behavioral therapy. And if for those of you listening, if you download the app, there's actually some tool tips built into why each practice is so helpful. But traditional cognitive behavioral therapy, they don't start with what you think. They start with your behavior. That your stress or your negative thoughts or your distracted thoughts or your overwhelming thoughts will lead to a feeling, which will then lead to some sort of behavior that you don't want, whether that's hypertension, high blood pressure, you have panic attacks, cold sweats, a physical reaction in some way, you get some sort of outburst in the way that you speak. Well, true cognitive behavioral therapy starts with the behavior. And we utilize things like breathing, meditative relaxation exercises, physical activity, because and again, if you track some of the work of Bessel van der Kolk, which is a leading authority in trauma, the body keeps the score. Your body will tell you far faster that you are anxious than your brain will. It just will. And so if that's the case, then why not start with some physical realities? And in fact, you typically cannot think about what you're anxious about clearly until your body is calm. And so you have to kind of Jedi mind trick your body into thinking it's calm before it's actually calm. And you do that with these relaxation techniques.
Yeah, and I'm really interested about the prevalence, or I guess the first step in this process, because I know from personal experience those physical activities of breathing and or muscle relaxation and or exercise or other things that I've used, techniques and tools, the physical act has calmed my body. But at some point for healing, do you have to go back to the thinking? Scripturally, guard your hearts and minds, right? Doesn't real long-term change start by going back to the thinking when you're in a place where you can, like when you're in a acute panic attack, going back to your thinking is probably destructive, right? You're not on safe ground to do that.
Correct.
But if you can calm the brain the way God intended the brain to be, you can then go back to the thought patterns that led to the anxiety in the first place. Do you follow what I'm saying? And I'm wondering scripturally how that comes together with modern mental health practices, how you reconcile those two as a pastor and a therapist.
Yeah. Boy, that feels like two different questions, and I'll try to touch on them both. Maybe I can do it with a story. I think that's probably the most helpful. For those listening, recently, about a month and a half ago, I lost my dad. He died of cancer and Parkinson's and some other realities. And 2.5 weeks after he passed away, my family went to Mackinac Island, and there were some tour groups on the island, and my mother-in-law and father-in-law were with us. And here, let me just, to be completely honest, I'm an introvert in a family of extroverts. I go to Mackinac Island to be alone, to be away from everybody that I know. I literally have to get on a boat for 30 minutes to get away from human society to the degree I can. And so we're on this island and we're at breakfast, and my in-laws, who are wonderful, amazing human beings who are extroverts, wanted to bring a bunch of people to the table and introduce them to their teacher wife, or their teacher daughter, and their therapist pastor son. And it was a combination, Mike, of the grief. It was a combination of the stress of the season that I'd been in, and a combination of just being overly stimulated with human socialization. My chest started to tighten up. I couldn't breathe. My mind was racing. I got sweaty. And you know what I felt? I felt like I was having a panic attack. I've only had it one other time in my life. And I was like, there is no amount of human thinking that's going to get me out of this. I need to go outside. I need 10 minutes. I need to breathe. I need to make sure that my body and my brain are calm, so then I can ask the question, what's really going on? The true lasting change comes when we can ask that question of what am I really anxious about in this moment? And what am I attaching to that anxiety? And for me, and this is something that we do in the app, after the breathing, you have to answer the question, what are you worried about? And then the second question is, why are you worried about it? What are you attaching to it? What's going on? And for me, in that moment, what I was anxious about was all of these people coming to the table.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you why I was really, really anxious about it. Because for like a week and a half after my dad died, everybody wanted to hug me and tell me I was going to be okay. And I was kind of sick of being around people hugging me and telling me I was going to be okay. I'll just be honest. Like
Yeah.
I don't have it in me anymore.
Yeah.
And so, there are a couple of verses, there are a couple of thoughts, but I think in the Psalms, David says these words. He says, "Search me, my God, and see if you can find any anxious way within me." And
Wow.
now there's other translations. Maybe you've heard, "Search me, O God, and find any unright way within me." But the actual word is more rooted in see if there's any anxiety within me. And here's, I know this is going to sound crazy. I know there are some people who would argue with me on this. I believe everybody has anxiety. Now, some feel it more keenly. Some would have what is called an anxiety disorder. But I
Yeah.
think every human being has a moment of anxiety every single day. And I think we all carry worry within us. I think the scriptures, even Jesus himself says to be careful that we can be concerned, but not be overly concerned. That is what he calls worry in the New Testament, when we are overly concerned with things that we are naturally concerned about. So I think we're all prone to being overly concerned at times. And when David writes, "Search me, O God, and see if there's any anxious way within me," I think he's being honest to say, as a human experience, it's important for us to, when anxiety comes up or when we feel triggered, to say, what's going on behind all of this? What's driving this? Because it's usually, I think our anxiety is an opportunity to pay attention to what's really going on inside our hearts and minds.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. And the way that you design the app to first deal with the physical symptom and then get to the intellectual question or the what's really going on. Like and it's usually, at least I'm just speaking from my own experience using the app and in years of doing this through journaling or whatever, when I can get my mind and body to a calmer state, when I'm not in fight or flight, and when I'm not in the middle of fight or flight, a panic attack where the rational part of my brain isn't functioning. It's just my body's reacting to perceived danger. But when I can get out of that and I can become calm again and ask those questions. And in the app, the way you design the app, you go through the questions. What are you worried about? What are you stressed about? What is on your mind? And you can journal. The answers are usually pretty obvious to me. Like in the story you related, the loss of your father, the being an introvert amongst people, you weren't alone. People that wanted to hug you, tell you you're going to be okay for the 100th time. You can identify, I can relate to that and identify those things and say, well, yeah. And in a way, that's relieving too, because you can look at it and go, well, no wonder I have anxiety, right? No wonder I have, it's not an abnormal reaction. I can identify where it came from.
Yeah.
And then talk about, well, what do I do to work through that? What do I do to heal from that? What does the Bible say about those things, right? For a person of faith, if you're not a person of faith, you can look at it and say, what are the next steps?
Yeah.
For me as a person of faith, for you as a person of faith, I look at it scripturally and I say, well, what am I called to do with this, right? In some cases, I'm called to take action. I'm called to do something. Some cases, I'm called to let it go and not be overly concerned the way you described Jesus's teaching.
That's right. And Jesus, even when he talks about being overly concerned, he even points to the world around. He says, "Hey, open your eyes to the world around you. Look at what was right in front of you. Consider the birds." And incidentally, that is not a suggestion. The word "consider" there is actually a mandate. Like Jesus says, "I want you to look at the birds." And this is a side note because it's not in the app, but for those of you who struggle with anxiety, it would probably be really good to wake up at 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning and just listen to the birds for 20 minutes. Because they teach us something. And Jesus says that, like, hey, like, he takes care of them. God takes care of them. He's going to take care of you too. And then there's this other interesting bit in Philippians, which if you're a follower of Jesus and if you have anxiety, you probably, memorize Philippians 4, 6, and 7, which don't be anxious about anything, but by prayer and petition and with thanksgiving, make your requests known to God. And the peace of God will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. And so there's this element that I think is really important, and it's that Thanksgiving part. There's a gratitude component that psychosocially and when we understand neuroscience is actually really relevant to our journey of learning how to find mastery over these moments of anxiety. Gratitude plays a powerful role in combating anxiety. The truth is anxiety and the source of anxiety lives in our brain, lives in what is known as the limbic system, and it's triggered by the amygdala. But the elements of gratitude and curiosity live in what are called the cortex, neocortex, and the prefrontal cortex. So incidentally, I mean, that's a lot of neuroscience language, but it's enough to say that anxiety lives in a different part of the brain than gratitude.
Right.
When you focus on gratitude, you're actually forcing your brain to get out of the negative and critical space or the reactive space, and you're forcing your brain to move into a more positive space. And gratitude, there's a part of our brain, really interesting, called the reticular activity center. It's the RAC for short. And for those of you who are familiar with the game I Spy, if you have children and you've ever gone on a road trip, you've played this game. I spy with my little eye something blue. Watching this video with you here, Mike, I can see go blue behind you. Like my mind immediately starts hunting for what is blue. Well, the RAC is responsible for hunting for what we are looking for. And the RAC also goes beyond color and shapes, and it moves into situations and circumstances. So if you are a person who has a predominantly negative view on the world and your anxiety spirals off of that negativity, maybe you fall into what is called catastrophizing, and you can go from one negative outcome to the worst possible case scenario before your brain is even aware of it. If you are prone to that, your RAC is trained to hunt for elements of life that will, in fact, confirm why you should be anxious.
Yeah.
But it can be retrained. And evidence has shown if you practice gratitude on a regular basis, your RAC will then look for reasons to confirm why we should, in fact, be grateful. And it moves from the day is going to be crap to, wow, the sun is shining today, and I think I'm going to be all right.
What's fascinating about what you just described through the neuroscience is by actively engaging the part of your brain that is not anxiety producing, not fear producing, where gratitude lives, using like a gratitude journal, things I'm grateful for, you are not only calming your brain, but you're retraining your brain. I think in neuroscience, they say the brain is highly elastic, right? It can be retrained. It can be the thought patterns and the synapses that are connected today can be retrained to connect in a different way. So if they're naturally inclined toward anxiety and fear, those connections can be broken and new connections can be formed with techniques and with tools and with retraining, right? With expert help. And that's an amazing thing, right? Because, and I can't overstate how amazing that is, because being a person who's lived his entire life with anxiety disorder and found tools that have helped, the turning point years ago, decades ago for me came with the realization, I didn't have the language for it that you and I are using today, but the realization that this is not some outside monster that has control of me and I am completely helpless against. It's my own brain that I've allowed or I have trained in a certain way, maybe subconsciously, not intentionally, but that I also have the power within me to retrain it. Like I created it, I can uncreate it, is another way of saying it. That realization for a person who's an acute anxiety disorder that's having panic attacks on a regular basis. And believe me, I'm one of those people that at periods in my life had those. Like I have hundreds of them, thousands of them, I don't know. To realize that can be retrained was like the windows being blown open and fresh air coming in. It was like there was hope. I think that's the message you're trying to get across there.
Yeah, it is. And again, that's a skill. I'm not a fan. I hesitate to say I hate it because I understand where it comes from, but I'm not a fan of have an attitude of gratitude. Well, here's the deal. Gratitude is not an attitude. It's a practice, first and foremost. You don't get the attitude without the practice. Nobody drifts towards health we drift towards unhealth. That's
Yeah.
just the truth. And so if you want to be intentional about your growth, then you also have to be intentional about the practices that you participate in. And, and I love just talking about scripture that backs this up and all of that. In Romans 12, the apostle writes, don't conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And there's a lot to be said about this. And some of this we might be taking a little out of context, but it's true in this respect. One, there is a natural, or I would say unnatural or sinful inclination to move into despair and negative thought patterns that are destructive. Go into the theology of sin and the way that brokenness works. It's much easier to go into a destructive pattern. It's not healthier, but it's easier. And then, so Paul says, don't do that. And so what's his solution? He's like, be transformed by what? Renewing of your mind. In psychosocial terms, we'll call it cognitive flexibility. You don't have to think that way. You can think differently. You have a choice. And then he says this really interesting bit. Well, then you'll be able to understand God's will, like what God wants for you, his best for you, and it's good, pleasing, and perfect. And so, like, if you really know, like, the good, beautiful elements of life that God created for you, that comes with changing the way you think. And there's a great book on this, Change Your Brain, Change Your Life. That's the title of the book. And I'm sure you've read that. It's an amazing resource.
I have. There's another one called Take Every Thought Captive, which is a fascinating book. Have you read that? Yeah. And it's based on that verse, be not transformed to this world, or be not conformed to this world, but transformed by the renewing of your mind, or the retraining of your mind is another way of saying it. That the book is based on that. And then it goes on to talk about, well, how do you do that? Right? Because that sounds great, but how do you do it? And a lot of it is what you're talking about. It's through practice and intentionality and techniques. And that's why I find your app to be so powerful. And it's not just the app, your company, the Worry Work Group, you do this with businesses, right? You mentioned earlier in the intro that you work with businesses who have recognized that our people are not healthy. And a lot of it was exacerbated by the pandemic. A lot of it has been exacerbated by society and the way that things have evolved in society, but it's having an impact on the business, right? Without mental health and mental balance, their people are not able to perform at their best. And so therefore the business can't perform at their best. So what do you do with the Worry Work Group? How do you engage them? And what does that look like for businesses that you work with?
Such a great question. So I think it's good to make a distinction. So yes, we have the Worry Work Group that created the app. That is a group designated and kind of dedicated to creating content to help people be informed about it and anxiety. And then another part of my job is I am a workplace chaplain. Our churches, we created this chaplaincy ministry, which is a little bit like Marketplace Chaplains or Corporate Chaplains of America, but we provide emotional and spiritual and mental health support for businesses. And so what I do with that, and that is fascinating. So there's, man, Mike, I don't know if we have enough time for all of this, but I'll give you the short end of it. So just for context, in 2022, 175 men in Michigan in the construction industry died by suicide. 175 in 1 year.
Michigan.
In Michigan. Just Michigan.
Man, I had no idea.
Yeah, it's wild. So I do a lot of work with skilled trades, predominantly men in the skilled trades. I work with construction companies, electrical companies, you name it. Skilled trades, that's one of the big areas that we lean into, mostly because of that number that I just gave you. That is a staggering number. For those listening, for comparison, the number of workplace deaths that occurred on job sites in construction in 2022 was 8. So if you're tracking and you're a statistician or you like numbers, mental health is actually almost 20 times more lethal than job place safety. And that's held true. That's held true over the years. And one of the things that we do is we come in, we do trainings on mental health. We talk about mental health. I have a podcast called Chaplaincy on the Go, where I talk about mental health. Mike's been a guest on the podcast as well. We give the skills, the tools. I promote the app, talk about the app, and we give opportunity and options. We also provide triage counseling and one-to-one phone calls where you can talk to a counselor. You can talk to me. You can talk to one of our chaplains on staff, and we have mental health trained professionals to help field phone calls. Because sometimes, Mike, you have a bad day. Sometimes you just have a bad moment that you think about all day. And if you've got somebody you can call that you know and is safe and can help you walk through it, you'd be amazed at what you can do in 15 minutes. Now, I'm a big
Yeah.
fan of 15-minute sessions of therapy. I think that's really beneficial too. But sometimes you just need 15 minutes. And you need
Yeah.
some perspective. You need some safety. I mean, so that's what we do with businesses, and that's also another just really exciting part of my job.
It's interesting, working with skilled trades. I just want to ask you the question because I've always been fascinated and it may be a stereotype, but men in general, and I'll speak for myself early on, I had a tendency, and I think I've seen this in the support groups that I've facilitated and been a part of over the years, and my work with a nonprofit in West Michigan called the Anxiety Resource Center. I've seen that men are at times resistant to admit that there's a mental health issue going on with them. And
Yeah.
do you find that, to be true? You're working with skilled trades, you're working with guys that, I don't know, maybe it's a stereotype. Are they inclined to say, look, I'll just tough it out. I'll work my way through it. I don't need to talk to somebody. I don't need a corporate chaplain. I don't need a worry work app. I'm just gonna tough it out. Is that an inhibitor to healing? Are you still seeing that as prevalent in society today?
Yes. The short answer is yes. I still see it. Where it comes from, man, I heard a counselor and author once say that by the time we're 5, girls have more words than boys. Girls have about, I think, 250 words or something like that. And well, maybe it's by the time we're 2 or 3, but girls just have more words than boys.
Yeah.
They just do. Which means that girls have more words to describe their emotions than boys do, which is true. That doesn't mean that they have less feelings. Just men have less words to describe how we feel. I think that's true. So I think that's a problem. 2, there is, and this is another buzzword in culture, but I'm going to say it anyway, just because it's important. There is this idea of toxic masculinity where I have to be tough. I have to be a man, and real men don't cry. That idea.
Yeah.
And I hate that phrase. That idea that real men don't cry. And I'll just say this, and it's probably going to be offensive to somebody listening, and I'm okay with that. I don't want to offend you, to hurt your feelings, but I'm okay if this offends you to this point. I find that the men who have trouble accessing and expressing their emotions are some of the weakest men I know.
Yeah, I was going to go there. I was going to say that in my experience in working with people with anxiety disorders, not as a therapist, but just as a friend or as a someone who's been where they are and cares about them through my work in the nonprofit and with others, men that are willing to be open are some of the bravest, toughest guys I've ever met. And it's partially because they don't know what society's going to say, or there may be a stigma associated with it. I used to have people say that to me in my business. I shared this on your podcast, I think, when I was growing my business and I'm leading this company, and I would tell people publicly that I have anxiety disorder. People would say to me, you can't do that because there's a stigma. People may think less of you. And I rejected that because to me, I was being authentically me. I was being honest. And what I found was people responded to that.
Yeah.
And what I then found was that other men and women too, people in general, were willing to come to me with trust and say, hey, I'll tell you something about myself. And it wasn't always anxiety. It was something deep though. And we made real connection because of my willingness to be open. And I don't know that that was from bravery. I think it was more from desperation. I knew that hiding it was the worst thing I could do, that I only strengthened the monster, so to speak. But by putting it out there in the open, all of a sudden it wasn't so big anymore.
That reminds me of in the book of John, chapter 1, we read that Jesus is the light, and in him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. And then there's that interesting passage, which I'm sure you've heard before, that the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And I have found that to be so true, that when we bring things into the light, the darkness loses its power. And in the end, Mike, it's the secrets that kill us in the end. It's the things that you can't say out loud that hurt us the most. And there's true power in saying it out loud. And I would say, even to this point, because I have that too. I have people that when I talk about my anxiety or I talk about my struggles, even as a pastor, people say, you can't say that because people are just uncomfortable with that. I'm like, no, you're uncomfortable with that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so maybe you need to take a critical look at your own anxiety. What about me being honest is making you anxious? Be aware of your own anxiety. And people don't like it when I put that back on them. But the truth is, like when someone says, Josh, just don't think you should say that. Like, well, that's a great thought for you, but I'm going to say it anyway because it's not sinful or wrong. And maybe you have a problem with anxiety and you need to confront it. And my vulnerability is not comfortable for you. That sounds like a you problem.
I would agree. Yeah, I guess as we wrap up, and we could talk, Josh, I could talk to you for, we could go on for hours, and I would love to, but I know our listeners would probably tune out at some point. As we wrap up, if you're a person who is struggling with anxiety and you feel overwhelmed and you feel helpless, and what are some immediate things that you would recommend? I mean, what are some steps they could take today to help move forward in their healing journey? Because I said at the beginning, and you've reaffirmed throughout this podcast, that there is healing. Anxiety is treatable. There are techniques, tools, and things that you can learn to retrain your brain. But what can a person do today to start that path if they don't know where to turn?
Yeah. So, boy, let me just if I can, just take a pastoral approach here. And by that, I mean, before I try to give you a bunch of solutions, because there are solutions. One, be kind to yourself. The world can be really hard. Anxiety is really cruel. I've learned that over the years. Anxiety is so cruel. It's so cruel. And if you have an inner critic, like I have an inner critic, you probably already know that you say things about yourself to yourself that you would never say out loud to someone else. And if you have anxiety and you struggle with it, chances are you've probably thought this thought: what's wrong with me? Why am I like this? And you maybe even have thought, I hate that I'm like this.
Or I'm
So
the only
just,
one like this.
or I'm the
Yeah,
only one, yeah, I'm alone,
yeah,
whatever iteration of that. So the first thing I would say is step one, be kind to yourself. Give yourself the dignity of treating yourself like you would probably treat other people in that respect, with a little compassion. And then number two, realize you're not broken, not in the way you think. Here's the really crazy bit about anxiety. Though it takes us to an irrational place, it's actually really logical. When you follow the way that anxiety works, it's if this, then this, if this, then this. Like there's actually a very logical, natural process. I've found that some of the smartest, most creative people have the highest capacity for catastrophizing, because the more creative you are, there's no end to where you can end up in your mind. And
yeah,
so to start in a perspective of saying, what's wrong with me and I'm broken, you're already starting off on the wrong foot. First of all, your brain is doing exactly what it's supposed to. It's just running amok. And so you need to bring it to heel. So be kind to yourself. Know that you're not broken in the way that you think. And then next, take a deep breath. Take a deep breath. Breathe. We need air for life. If you take nothing else away from this podcast, spending time out in the beauty of the world, breathing, is just good for you. Then find some practices that work for you. You can Google resources for anxiety and there is no end. In fact, you might even get anxious reading through them because you're so stimulated by how much you're seeing. Try some for a period of 24 hours, a week, a month. Track your progress. That's so important. Track your symptoms. Do you feel better, not just day by day, but do you feel better overall? What's interesting is when you track a worry journal, or you have a gratitude journal, or you dedicate some time to writing this down in some way. And again, some of this is built in the app, and I'm not trying to shamelessly plug that. I'm just saying it's there. When you do that, you can start to track themes. You can start to be aware of triggers. And when you're aware of themes and triggers, that's where the real power comes in,
yeah,
because you know what your triggers are. You can say, well, why does that trigger me? What's really going on here? And it
yeah,
probably stems back to childhood. I'm just going to throw that out there. There's a 90% chance that whatever you're triggered by comes back to something that happened when you're a kid. And here's what's really interesting about trauma. Trauma dissociates. It disintegrates. And so when we go through a painful experience in our past, our brain naturally tries to protect us, and it keeps us remembering. Well, once we move toward healing, it actually integrates. And as you do this work, you might become more and more aware of things that happened in the past that you didn't even think about, and you can connect them. And then there's true healing. You can heal at the innermost part of your childhood and being. And that's why once you get through all the skills, whether it's breathing, relaxation techniques, mindfulness techniques, once you get past all of that, because you can do that on your own. Eventually, you have to find your way into a safe and sacred space with either a licensed professional or a spiritual advisor who's done the work, who can help you combat some of those core pains that are
Yeah.
driving your behavior.
That's very helpful. I appreciate that. If folks want to reach out to you either for chaplaincy, you have a business, or if they're interested in the app, like
Yeah.
what's the best, do you have a website that would be really convenient, or what's the best way to reach you?
Yeah, I do. Easiest way probably to find me is just go to joshzoerhof.com. That's my name, and that'll take you to my website. That will connect you to the work of the Worry Work app and the Worry Work group. That'll put you in touch with my podcast. That'll give you connection to email me. It'll even give you links to the church and the chaplaincy and all of that. So I'll probably just direct you there because that makes the most
Okay.
sense. And
That's
but
great.
yeah,
That's simple. That's easy.
Yep.
Yeah, and we'll put that link on the podcast too. So we'll have that on the podcast so that you can click on it and connect with Josh if you so choose. The other thing to keep in mind if you're listening is that the Anxiety Resource Center is available to you. That's anxietyresourcecenter.org, located in West Michigan, but with online options if you're not listening from West Michigan, lots of Zoom options, support groups, learning library, special educational sessions, and just a group of people who care about you and are willing to help and point you in the right directions. Reach out to Josh, reach out to Anxiety Resource Center, reach out to somebody, like Josh said, a spiritual advisor, a licensed therapist. Go online and Google. There's help everywhere, and we're with you, and we love you, and we wish nothing but the best for you on your journey. Josh, I can't thank you enough for being on, man. It's been a tremendous honor, and it's always lots of fun to talk with you. Thank you for spending the time with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
We will be back next time on Anxiety Unraveled, brought to you each and every month by the Anxiety Resource Center. Thank you for listening. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.